Welcome to Accountability for Dearborn's second Data Town Hall event. We are very happy to be in community, learning from each other to work towards a better world. We'll begin by having our speakers introduce themselves. My name is Alexandra, and I'm with Accountability for Dearborn as well as Michigan Liberation, and I work in Dearborn as a behavior therapist and coordinator. And now I'll pass it over to Beth.
Hi, my name's Beth Bailey. I live in Dearborn. I'm a third generation Dearbornite. I've lived here 7 years. I'm also a researcher, and I am the person that submitted the FOIA request for the data that we received from the Dearborn Police Department. And I, among others, have been conducting the analysis of the data. So I'm so thrilled to see you all on the call here today. And I hope that we can all learn together. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm going to pass it over to Lauren.
Hi, my name is Lauren Cochran. I'm with Michigan Liberation, and I'm a Berkeley High School graduate and a college student. And I am here to share my experiences with police within schools, and I'm excited to hear this call.
My name is Trinae Duckworth. I am the executive director and founder of Survivor Speak. I'm happy to be working in collaboration with Accountability for Dearborn and Michigan Liberation, so thank you all.
Okay, and to begin, we will set expectations, and these are items that are never up for debate. So first, racism exists. Racism is a current problem that impacts every aspect of individuals and communities. Second, lived experiences are valid. Knowledge exists in many forms, and that includes the knowledge created through lived experiences. Even if someone's lived experiences are atypical according to data and statistics, it is still valid. Third, we focus on impact over intent. While impact may be neutral or good, or intent may be neutral or good, actions are what we are focused on. The impact of legislation, policies, budgetary decisions, and actions matter more than intent. We are hosting these data town halls as part of an effort to help our community understand the role of police and policing in Dearborn, and Dearborn's role in our region. In this data town hall, we will dive deeper into the calls of service data received from Dearborn Police Department. We'll discuss the dangerous narrative of policing, the criminalization of children through police presence in schools, the role of suspicion in the weaponization of police against Black people, and the imperative of establishing teams of nonviolent emergency responders. And now I'll turn it over to the presentation over to Beth.
Thank you so much, Alexandria. All right, so we're just going to start with an overview of the data, what kind of data we received, and how we make sense of them. So the term calls to service refers to calls made by the public and other police officers to bring the police into a situation. These calls are recorded and reported through the dispatch center that handled them. Accountability for Dearborn received through the Freedom of Information Act request, calls to service 2009 to 2020, July 2020. By year, organized by type of call, so the reason that the call was placed. These data do not include demographic information on the caller or others involved in the situation. Additionally, we're not able to provide information about the actions taken in response to the call. But despite these limitations, these calls to service were extremely valuable in helping us understand how our communities perceive the role of the police, how the police department's resources are being used, and what types of situations the police are being called into. So from the raw data that we received, we took the individual call types and then organized them into broader categories that we call codes. An example of a code is a traffic code. So all calls relating to traffic incidences were included in this category. This includes listings like traffic stop, traffic offense, traffic accident. We also looked at each description to identify if the call was to report a criminal activity, a request for assistance, and or the reporting of suspicious or concerning circumstances. So crimes reported included listings like larceny or hit and run accident. Requests for help included items like 911 welfare check or assist citizen. And reports of circumstances included items like suspicious person or road hazard. We also looked at the characteristics of calls, including the types of situations that officers are being called into, the types of services officers are being asked to provide. So for example, the characteristics of a vehicle lockout call are going to be pretty different from the characteristics of a suicidal person situation. And from all of this sorting and resorting, we were able to identify a few patterns. And for the whole period, what we found was that 26% of calls to service were traffic related. Again, calls relating to accidents or calls relating to reckless driving. 25% were calls for the administration of human services, like welfare checks or overdoses. 16% were for municipal services, so things like road hazards, requests for road salt. And then 32% were law enforcement, 23% of which were requests for patrols. And then the other 10% were non-traffic, non-patrol law enforcement calls. So from this type of thematic analysis, we were able to find trends across our data, relate these trends to existing research and resources, and begin to piece together a deeper understanding of how police are brought into our communities and what it means when they are. So we're actually going to start by talking about the danger narrative in policing. And the reason that we're starting here is because this narrative informs so many decisions that we make as a community and as a society about how to invest our resources. The danger narrative is simply that policing is a dangerous job. We see it come up in police training, where officers are told that any vehicle encounter has the potential to become dangerous. And in statements made by public officials, a common refrain is the brave young men and women in blue who put their lives on the line every day. And it's pretty common that someone new to these conversations about policing may feel resistant about shifting responsibilities away from the police because they believe that armed officers are necessary to manage the danger imposed by the situations that police are being called into. In addition to creating resistance to move responsibilities away from the police, the danger narrative has a significant impact on policies and practices that officers operate within and that officer accountability is determined through. Officers are trained to perceive that any apparent lack of compliance is a signal that a situation is about to become dangerous, and that they need to use force to compel compliance. And by looking critically at this rhetoric, we can identify the consequences of this narrative and the policy solutions to addressing the harm it causes. The impact of the danger narrative must be contextualized by the fact that we live in a society where we are trained to view Black people as inherently more dangerous, more violent, or more criminal. This bias doesn't need to be a bias that we're consciously aware of. It simply has to just hang out in the background as we make these snap decisions. When officers are trained to view their own fear responses as enough to justify the escalation of use of force, we see horrific outcomes for Black people. The prevalence of the danger narrative means that officers and private security's reported perceptions of danger are sufficient justification for murdering civilians. These individuals who are pictured on this slide were each murdered in Dearborn, with no criminal charges brought against the individuals responsible for their deaths. Ernest Griglen, Kevin Matthews, and Janet Wilson were all murdered by Dearborn police officers, while Frederick Finley was murdered by a Fairlane Mall security guard. In each case, their killer's fear was cited as a reason to dismiss criminal charges. We'll be talking more about the circumstances of each of these deaths later and the policy solutions that could have protected them, and if implemented, could protect others in the future. What's more important is that we reflect on the fact that each of these individuals were members of our shared community who should still be here, and that their families deserve justice. So if you're anything like me, you find yourself asking the questions of how these circumstances came about. And while it can be tempting to simply write off these situations as tragic yet singular result of a bad decision, in critically examining the danger narrative, we see that police violence is not only accepted, it's expected. We began by telling officers that their work brings with it extreme danger, that the best way to identify the threat of danger is through whether or not a subject is behaving in a way that the officer recognizes as deferential, and that the most effective way to mitigate the danger is through compelling compliance through force. We see that this leaves the door wide open for internalized biases to inform what officers recognize as compliant behaviors. It is no accident that the 4 people on the previous screen are Black. We also use the same narrative to justify the use of deadly force. When an officer harms a civilian through the use of force, that use of force is considered justified as a response to credible fear. As the action is seen as justified, the officer is not held accountable for the harm that they caused. Again, this is especially dangerous for Black people, for individuals who are from cultures that are different from the officers, people who are living with mental illness, disabled people, and people who live at the intersection of these identities. So because the danger narrative has this huge impact on the jobs that we're willing to shift away from the police department, because it impacts the practices and policies and accountability that relate to policing, we realized that it was super important that we test the danger narrative. But there's no official test that you can do to stick into a situation and see if it's dangerous. There's not a thermometer that you can stick into a situation and it says there's 100 degrees of danger here or 50 degrees of danger. We had to come up with a way to measure it on our own. So in our case, that broke down to the presence of actively dangerous situations, the likelihood of harm that officers encounter, and the job fatality rate. So to answer these questions, we looked at the calls to service to see if officers were being called to interrupt active situations, or if they were being called into situations after the danger had passed. We also looked to see which calls to service occurred most frequently and identified whether those situations were demonstrated to be risky. And finally, we looked at on-the-job fatality rate for police officers as compared to other professions. So in taking a look at the data, we found that overwhelmingly, officers are not being called into active situations. The 86% of the time, what we saw was that officers were being called in to take a report after the situation had passed, to provide patrols, or to serve as police escort. We also identified that only 12% of circumstances placed an officer into added danger beyond that which someone going about their daily life would encounter. And only 1% of the time were officers being called in to address an actively violent subject. The next thing that we took a look at was the risk at traffic stops. Because traffic enforcement was the largest proportion of calls to service with 26%, we looked at the risks associated with traffic stops. We also know that traffic stops come with an extremely low risk of, subject-initiated violence. And when there is subject-initiated violence, the use of a weapon is extremely uncommon. And when a weapon is used, it's usually a knife or a blunt object. And then in 98% of cases where there is subject-initiated violence, which is, again, extremely rare, officers walk away with having sustained no or minor injuries. So we see that it's extremely uncommon. At every step of the process, the size of the pie gets smaller and smaller. So Then finally, we took a look at on-the-job fatalities. Considering the low rate of dangerous circumstances, it follows that police officers experience lower rates of on-the-job fatalities compared to other professions. And according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, police are 14th on the list of the most dangerous jobs. When we look at which jobs are actually the most dangerous, we see that refuse collectors are 2.3 times more likely to die on the job than police officers, and loggers are 9 times more likely to die on the job than police officers. So this leads us to our policy recommendations. Having taken a critical look at the danger narrative, we can see that it's safe to shift things away from the police department. And in fact, there's actually some imperative to do this. Shifting the enforcement of civil traffic violations away from the police department to an agency that is not also responsible for enforcing criminal law ends up being safer for everybody, because you don't have this dual role that officers are being asked to play to criminalize people. It removes the fear of being criminalized, so high-speed chases are a lot less likely. And it allows us to shift from a punishment-focused to a resource-focused response. Also, set expectations for officer behaviors that do not perpetuate the danger narrative. This means reviewing all police officer training, including police academy training curriculum, to identify all instances spreading the danger narrative, and require administering agencies to remove these instances. Terminate contracts with agencies who refuse or fail to make these changes, and hold officers accountable to the standard of conduct. Formalize the definition of appropriate use of force from what is reasonable to what is necessary, and then terminate officers who use force above what was necessary. All right. The next thing that we noticed in our data was this heavy emphasis on patrols. One of the fastest growing entries on the data was park and walk. This single listing accounted for between 7 to 14% of the calls to service in any given year. So to understand what the data were telling us, we had to understand what this description was referring to. So Park and Walk is a patrols program where officers park their cars and walk around public areas. The belief underlying these programs is that visible police presence makes communities safer. And this emphasis on patrols is actually something that we see very commonly in Dearborn Police, very heavy emphasis on patrols. In fact, 60% of the police department's force is employed by the patrol division. And so that leads us to our next question, which is, do patrols make communities safer? And spoiler alert, the answer is no. Research has pretty reliably shown that increased patrols do not correlate to decrease in violent crime rates. However, it has been difficult to show a causal relationship. That is until 2014 to 2015, when the New York Police Department went on a 6-week work to rule strike, where they continued to accept calls to service and record calls to service, but they stopped all proactive policing procedures. And their intention with this strike was to demonstrate how important proactive policing was to safety in New York. When researchers looked at the data after the fact, however, they saw that the rate of major crimes had actually dropped in that period. By taking themselves out of the picture, the New York Police Department accidentally demonstrated that their presence was disrupting and destabilizing communities. And the other thing that we need to understand about Park and Walk is that it overwhelmingly takes place at schools. 60% of the Park and Walk patrols in 2018 were conducted at Dearborn schools, at Dearborn public schools. This is in addition to the school resource officer program. So in addition to the 7 full-time school resource officers that are placed at the high schools, there is an additional walkthrough that every high school gets of a separate, or every school in Dearborn gets of a separate officer. So we see that there's heavy police presence in schools, and we see that this has resulted in the criminalization of children. We see that police issued 713 citations in schools in 2019, which was up from 572 in 2018 and 503 in 2017. So we see this number increasing. And the reality is that the presence of police in schools fails to protect children. I was in school when school shootings started to become a concern, and when we started to get school resource and liaison officers. And the reality is that in those 20 years since Columbine, no school resource officer has ever stopped a shooting from happening. And there is no evidence to suggest that police in schools deters criminal activities. So we see that there is no positive of the presence of police in schools. We also see that police presence in schools disrupt students emotionally, socially, and academically. We see that higher rates of suspension, lower rates of graduation, and higher rates of arrest. And we see all of this feeding into what's now known as the school to prison pipeline, or the school to prison nexus. And the reality is that police presence in schools makes it impossible to establish the conditions necessary to make meaningful changes in school culture. We know that Dearborn Public Schools have been working towards a more restorative justice model. We know that they've been working to lower suspensions. And having a police officer physically present in the school actually makes that more difficult. So at this time, I'm going to turn over the presentation to Alexandria and Lauren, who are colleagues with Michigan Liberation, and they can provide us with a little bit more context.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So
so over the last few weeks, I had the privilege of having conversations and learning from our next speaker. Over the summer, after the death of George Floyd, she not only marched and protested, but also took the bold act of turning her anger into action and started Protest Kids, where her and many other young adults and teens marched in suburban areas to make sure that those who were least affected knew that racial justice was important. And even though she recently started college, she's still making an effort to impact change. She's here today to share her perspective and experiences on police in schools. Here's Lauren Cochran.
Hi, thank you for that, Alexandria. So like she said, I went to Berkeley High School, and they had a major deal with police presence within schools. It was somewhat normal to see police in schools. There were a lot of kids who were on parole there, which wouldn't seem normal in any high school setting, but there will be parole officers like roaming the halls occasionally, and they will come in with their canine dogs to do drug raids and check lockers. So that if not only affected me seeing that within school and already having that as like it's already showing a negative effect and a negative impact on within what they think the students are. So it affected me learning too. I can't focus on learning anything within schools when you have 10 or like 3 officers patrolling the halls and all you hear is their walkie-talkies and the dogs. It's like your mind goes off of learning, and it's more of, safety. Are you safe in this type of environment? And with the higher rates of suspension and lower rates of graduation, that all comes from the school to prison pipeline effect. And with that, it starts with the zero tolerance policy and the harsh response to situations dealing with kids. It's under this policy, kids are more likely to be suspended and expelled. And kids who are suspended and expelled find it more harder to get back on track. And this only produces more disengagement and dropouts. And yeah, that's all I have. And I will pass it back over to Beth.
Thank you for sharing that, Lauren. It's so powerful to hear you speak about your experiences and how unnerving it sounds to hear those police officer walkie-talkies going off in the hallway, and just having the threat of criminalization hanging over your head. Like that's really powerful. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you, Lauren.
So let's talk about policy recommendations. In light of this information, these data, these experiences, and this evidence, we recommend immediate removal of Dearborn police from the Dearborn schools. We recommend the immediate termination of proactive policing and patrol programs. All right, then another area that we saw in the data were the criminalization of our neighbors. In 2019 alone, we saw over 7,500 calls to service made to report suspicious people or circumstances, which led us to the question of what makes someone suspicious. And again, this answer wasn't readily available. So we had to do some digging to see what characteristics of people and circumstances are being used to indicate suspicion. So what we looked at were police department documents, local news sources, and litigation against the city. And what we overwhelmingly found was that suspicion wasn't based on actual indicators of likelihood to commit a violent act. It was simply internalized biases that were being weaponized through activating the police against our neighbors of color. So the first clues came from the police department's Neighborhood Watch program. This is a program operated by the Dearborn Police, where residents are recruited to monitor their neighbors and contact the police if they are suspicious. On the police department's old website, and I noticed that this did not make it onto the new website, but on their old website, we see the types of circumstances that Neighborhood Watch is being instructed to bring the police into. And while many of these may seem reasonable, for example, if you see a broken window, we also see that nearly any activity could be considered suspicious. And so then we start to recognize that the true metric in determining whether the police are being called is internalized biases. So we see things like a parked vehicle that is either occupied or unoccupied. We see loitering around. We see heavy traffic from a home. We see somebody exercising who's not wearing clothes that you recognize as exercise clothes. We also took a look at the Police Blotter. The Times Herald provides a snapshot of who's being reported as suspicious. The Police Blotter publishes more descriptive reports of calls for service received by the different police departments in our area. It is an incomplete listing, so we shouldn't look at this as comprehensive. Despite this drawback, it does allow us to glean a different type of information other than strictly numeric data. So taking a look back through past issues, we kept an eye out for the listings that indicated the police were being called because someone was seen as suspicious by the caller. And while blotter reports can be inconsistent, so characteristics aren't always listed, we found a few instances where they were. And these instances included a caller calling because a Black man knocked on her door. And the police didn't let this man leave until he could prove that he had received her address through a dating app. We also see that a caller called because they saw somebody getting into a vehicle near their own vehicle. And the suspicious person was described as having dark skin. And then finally, through examining cases against the city and looking at local sources of information, we identified another pattern, one of officers engaging in violent interactions with men of color riding bicycles. We see what recently came out, Luther Gonzalez Hall, a Latino man who was biking home, asked for directions from a Dearborn police officer. After receiving the directions, Gonzalez Hall entered a nearby White Castle. The officer followed Gonzalez Hall inside, demanding to know why he had entered the restaurant. And Gonzalez Hall left the restaurant on his bicycle, was pursued by the officer, who proceeded to tackle Gonzalez Hall, breaking his foot in the process. We also see a 2019 Google one-star review where a Black man describes being tackled off of his bicycle for not having proper safety equipment. And then we also are familiar with the case of Ali Beydoun, an Arab American immigrant with a mental disability who experienced a panic attack when approached by Dearborn police officers while fixing his bike. Multiple officers beat him severely. Beydoun was hospitalized as a result of the attack. And in the newspapers afterwards, Dearborn police officers were quoted as saying, "It is common for criminals to use a bike." And this is in fact not a pattern that's unique to Dearborn. In 2015, Tampa PD revealed that they had been profiling people on bicycles. And in 2002, there was a lawsuit against East Point Police because they were explicitly instructed to stop every Black person that they saw riding a bicycle. So people of color riding bikes in Dearborn are being profiled and targeted by the police. Again, in this pattern, we see that people who are being regarded as suspicious are in fact people who are poor and people of color. The police are instructed to view people on bicycles as suspicious and respond to that instruction by targeting people of color riding bicycles. The police instruct civilians to call the police when they see joggers in their neighborhood who aren't wearing exercise clothes, and calls to the police are made accordingly. There's nothing inherently criminal or harmful about bike riders, just like there's nothing inherently more dangerous about someone jogging in khakis. White people weaponizing the police against Black people is a documented and studied phenomenon. And this is just one of the ways that the police are used to enforce white supremacy and racial segregation. Let's look at policy recommendations. With all of this in mind, we believe that it is time to replace Neighborhood Watch with neighborhood support and mutual aid networks that are not connected to the police department. The police department must record and report every interaction, not just those that result in a citation or arrest. This report must include the reason for the interaction, demographics of the subject, and the interaction's results. And the Dearborn Police must submit to an audit to identify all criteria for suspicion that are told to officers, both formally and informally, and cease using criteria that profiles based on any protected class or income level. I've been talking a lot. All right. The next thing that we need to address is that 47% of calls during this whole period were unrelated to enforcement of civil or criminal codes. These included over 70,000 calls to address domestic situations or conflicts, 38,000 calls to address people whose basic needs were going unmet, 6,600 calls to administer physical health care, 5,300 calls to administer mental health or substance use services, and over 200,000 calls for municipal services. This trend of pushing response to the police may reflect the systemic defunding of other municipal health and human services. And I'm actually going to turn the presentation over to Trisha from Survivors Speak right now. And she can give us a little bit more context about the impacts of this. Take it away, Trisha. You're muted, Trisha.
Okay, sorry about that. I could not unmute. So if you can, Beth, please go ahead and give me back the screen. I apologize. Very happy to be here with you all, but definitely not happy, right, to be talking about this topic. You know, when we think about the tragedies that come from police interactions with the public, we can definitely see why we want to lessen their contact with the public. And we understand that, especially, and this happens all over, but especially in Dearborn is our focus today. I do not have control of this screen, and I am not sure. Let's see here.
You can just tell me next slide and I'll click for you. How's that?
Okay. All right, thank you. So we understand that any interaction with Dearborn police could be escalated, right, to violent and deadly tactics, and as we learned earlier, these outcomes are expected and accepted. And it's really sad because it's not just by the police department, it's by the city, it's by the prosecutor's office, it is by our government as a whole. And it's really sad because why doesn't our government want to keep us safe? There are so many things that we could do to keep the citizens safe and ensure that these contacts do not happen. But time and time again, they do. All right, next slide. This was very, very heartbreaking. Ernest Griglen Jr. This happened back in 2008, over 12 years ago. It was totally sad to understand that someone that was in the middle of a health crisis. Now, if you know anything about people and their blood sugar, you know that sometimes their behavior can seem erratic. I'll never forget my brother-in-law. We were getting ready to go to the zoo as a family, and my brother-in-law had an attack. And so I didn't know what was going on. I just showed up, came in the house, and he attacked me. And I was like, oh my goodness, I was so scared. And this was like one of my first times, right, having this interaction. But we were able to talk him down. We were able to give him something that would allow his sugar to get in the place that it needed to be. We didn't have to call the police. We didn't even have to call the ambulance. We were able to do that ourselves. And in this case, this man's symptoms were mistaken for intoxication and his insulin pump for a gun. I mean, I don't even understand what this family is going through. And even 12 years later, what a tragedy for the city of Dearborn to have done this to the Griglen family. Again, this just proves why officers should not show up to these accounts. All right, next slide. And this not only saddens me, it just ticks me off. Because when you are operating a non-motor vehicle, there's no reason to have police contact. So they said, oh, well, he didn't understand, or he was doing this, he was doing that. No, you approach this man out of error from the beginning, unlawful detainment. And this man winds up brutalized and in the hospital. And then the city makes excuses. The police make excuses. There are always excuses, but never any resolve, as we will see a little further here. Next slide. This Kevin Matthews story reminds me of so many stories that we see across the country. And before we talk about Kevin, I think about in Philadelphia, where the man's mother called the ambulance because he was having a psychotic break. The police went, he came out, and the police shot him dead. Look at this. He wasn't even the suspect. He had nothing to do with this interaction. The police had someone separately pulled over. And when they recognize him, they pursue him. Why? We don't know. pursue him into the neighboring yard. And then of course there's a struggle. And then this young man was shot multiple times and he died. And it's such a sad thing because why is it that people are continuing to be seen as a threat because they have mental health issues? Why are we criminalizing those that battle mental health problems? It is an injustice, not only to Kevin Matthews, to his family, but to anyone that has a mental health disorder or is in a mental health crisis, because guess what? It could happen to any one of us. And this is another reason why we all need to pay attention. You would not want your loved one's life to end as Kevin Matthews' life did. So we really, really have to come up with some solutions that will stop these interactions with the police, especially Dearborn Police. Next slide. You know, these are, all of these accounts are so heartbreaking, but especially this one. How in the world is it that someone can be seen as a threat? How in the world could Janet Wilson be seen as a threat? How are you seen as a threat when you're in the car? All they had to do was stand down. Why? Why are we not standing down? Why are we not calling the appropriate people to help when individuals are in a crisis? This family lost their daughter, their sister, their loved one. And for what? Because the police thought that it was better not to pay attention to the fact that she was in a mental health crisis, and they thought that they would just use force instead. Why is using force something that they resort to first? And I think we heard it earlier. It is because these things are ingrained in their head from the beginning. If they are in the police academy and everything is danger, 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 of course they're going to take on this approach. I'll never forget, I got pulled over a little while ago. Came to the car with their hand on their gun. Why? Why? If I would have made one false move, I promise you, I wouldn't be sitting here right now. And so because Janet Wilson and so many others have these situations where they may act erratic or they may be in the middle of a health crisis, Dearborn Police thinks it's okay to harm its citizens or people that visit their town. It is a disgrace. And especially, again, because there's never any resolve. There's never any accountability. And that's why we as citizens have to call for accountability. This is why I love this group, Accountability for Dearborn. They need to understand that people are going to stay the course and see this thing through. So again, kudos to Accountability for Dearborn and to Michigan Liberation for all of your work in Dearborn, because it is definitely needed. Next slide, please. You know, first of all, when I think about individuals who are disabled, they're already operating at a deficit, right? And then you expect them to come into situations where they're dealing with the police and act like everything's okay. That's just not a reality. Nationwide, of all people killed by police annually, 25% were living with severe mental illness. 50% were disabled. And I just looked at a study at Harvard that it even reflects racism, because we know that 3.23% likely are Black Americans to be killed by police officers than our Caucasian brothers and sisters. These numbers are definitely horrible. You think about it. I seen a police officer one day tackle a man in a wheelchair who had no legs. Tell me why. Anybody, somebody, please tell me why. You don't have an answer, because you know that that type of behavior is not what any officer should exemplify in the community. If we're going to have police officers then why not change the narrative? Why not take away that danger factor and really learn your community and grow as one with the community? Why do you want to make people fear you? Especially citizens that have severe mental illness. They're surrounded by so many officers. How do you think they'll react? It's just ridiculous. Next slide, please. So, yes, domestic violence is definitely an issue. And I believe there was a recent case of that in Dearborn, where survivors are not really being protected the way they should be. Now, in this case, and people have all kind of opinions, so we're not even going to focus on that. What we're going to focus on is what could have been done in this case. Now, what we do know is that this home, okay, this address, multiple times the police were called there. Now, if the police were called to this home multiple times for domestic violence incidents, why in the world aren't they giving wraparound services for these individuals? The first time at the home, they should have connected the young lady with some supports. They should have connected the young man. Maybe he needed crisis intervention. Maybe he had anger management. I don't know what the issue was, but there were so many things that could have been done. And now I am also a domestic violence advocate. When I did my associate's degree, I was an intern at Safe House in Ann Arbor. And so this is very near and dear to my heart. And there are things that we can do to keep individuals safe. But why is the first thing to do always to kill people? In Ann Arbor, the Ara Rosser case, same instance. They were called to this home multiple times. Ara Rosser suffered mental illness, came to the house. Ara Rosser came out with a little small pocket knife. She was tased. She fell to the ground and dropped the pocket knife. And this is just all information that I just found out. Because of course, the media and the police will always spin that story to make themselves look good. After she had been tased and that pocket knife on the ground, the officer shot her in the chest. Shot her in the chest. Where was the threat? Oh, excuse me, on the ground? Because she had been tased and the knife right there next to her, out of her reach? All you had to do was kick the knife out of the way. You had already tased her. Why not just handcuff her? But take a step further back than that. If you were called to this home multiple times, why not give services to Ms. Rosser? Why not see through a lens of human kindness and decency and wrap around services for Ms. Rosser, because you understand that there is mental illness there, because you were told this on multiple occasions. Why? It is because of the narrative that is pushed to our police officers all across this nation. And as we can see right here in Dearborn, they were the wrong resource. They were the wrong people to protect. They didn't support and protect the survivor. They didn't keep anybody safe. And that's why we need to change the narrative. That's exactly why. Next slide, please. All right, good old policy recommendations, right? Because there's always something that we can do. And let me say this very quickly, and I talk too much, so I'm going to try to really hone in here. But while we hold our governmental officials accountable, we must hold ourselves accountable as well. Because these things happen all the time, and we look away. We see people being pulled over by the police, and we just keep going. We as a community have to really start paying attention We have to start pushing for accountability. We have to stay the course. We can't wait till what happens to Janet Wilson or Kevin Matthews, or we cannot wait until that happens. And then we get mad, we protest, and we go out. And then when that wears off, we're back to business as usual. So how in the world do we think that they're going to change business as usual when we're not there holding them accountable every step of the way? So this is why I want to say this first. Yes, there need to be policy changes, but no matter what policy is in place, we as citizens have a job to do as well. And that is to hold our governmental officials accountable. It is our responsibility. We vote some of these people in office, and we must push the envelope to hold them accountable while they're there. All right, let's jump in. Establish non-police response teams comprised of medic and crisis intervention workers. At Safe House, when someone is raped or there's a domestic violence, there's a whole squad that is on pager so that when you call in, they're meeting you at the hospital. Why can't they be met at the scene? Why can't they help from the inception of this crisis? They can, if we go ahead and implement this. Also, services provided, crisis counseling, suicide prevention. Right now, we are every Wednesday, and we do QPR, suicide prevention training. It's question, persuade, and refer. What this does is it arms people with the tools, right? It shows them what suicidal individuals look like, right? What they possibly signs and clues and cues. And then it gives them things to do to help that person get help in a non-threatening, very comforting way. Conflict mediation. Come on now. Conflict me. This is something that like we learned like in kindergarten, right? Like, why is this stuff that we don't even think about? It makes absolutely no sense. Welfare checks, substance use, domestic violence, transportation to services. We've got to think about the resources that are needed to help people. Because if we get people the help they need, then the effects or the risks are lessened. So we've got to do our part. Empower the community members. Like I told you, we are hosting these trainings every week. We are actually getting ready to start wellness checks again. We started them back with COVID. We're getting ready to start them again, just so that we can check in with people. I'm gonna tell you something. People are hurting right now. People are suffering. You know, this crisis had just sprung us all into immediate isolation, right? And so that does something to people's psyche and their mindset. So not everything is call the police, call the police. No, call a doctor, call the psychiatrist, call their pastor. There are plenty of people that can be called on. Call the social worker. I'm also a social worker. That is the profession that I'm in. I'm a social worker. Call me. I gave you our number, 734-252-6075. Call me. And we can get some help for you and get some help for the person that is in crisis. Man, look, we got to make sure that it's accessible. You know, I tell you, it's nothing like getting paid to go to training. You pay people to go to training, you're going to have that class filled from the rudder to the tutter. From the back to the front to the back, that class will be full. And guess what? People will be getting the tools that they need as well to help people. You know, and provided at no charge. There are plenty of grants out here, and there are plenty of services. And I say this all the time, we're probably the only craziest ones that will work for free. I don't care about a stipend or anything else. If people need help, we need to make sure that we're there doing that. And another barrier sometimes is childcare. We had a program called Strengthening Families. And when we thought about this program, we thought, well, wow, how are we going to do this? Because some people have kids that are very little. They can't sit through. Wow, no cost childcare. Ding, 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 ding. We fed the families. You know what I mean? We had things that if people would come, we would enter their name as in a drawing to get a video game for the household. I mean, there are so many things that we can do to get people this necessary training, and we should definitely do it. And it should be offered across the county. It should be offered, it needs to be offered nationwide, because this is a nationwide problem, and it has to be meaningful. And it can come along with other services as well. Naloxone right now is really huge. You know, people are at the overdose rate right now, especially through the COVID crisis, is outstanding. So we want to make sure that we're getting people the help that they need. And then lastly, domestic violence intervention, which is calling the calling the domestic violence hotline, and they will connect you to a plethora of services for you. And then lastly, de-escalate techniques. That if we do not stop acting like we don't understand what de-escalation means, and they have all of these trainings, but they do not de-escalate. There need to be measures put in place where if they don't de-escalate, then they can be placed on leave. Next time you lose pay. Next time you gone. I mean, it honestly, it shouldn't even be a next time and a next time, because they need to learn how to de-escalate, and we've got to start that in police academy training and get those. Lastly, I ain't even gonna say bad apples, because I'm under the premise that if the apple is bad, that means the tree is rotten. So we have to take a look at the foundations of these policing agencies so that we can get to the bottom of the racism and white supremacy that plagues those offices, and we can reimagine what policing looks like. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Trisha. I always appreciate hearing you speak. And it always kind of brings me back to the fact that we offer all of these like amazingly comprehensive service trainings to police officers, but we don't trust just average people to do these same things. We don't offer these same opportunities. Police officers get paid to go to training. They attend the trainings for free. So why don't we have that same deal for private citizens? I live in my house. If a crisis comes up in my house, I should be able to de-escalate that service. My community should prepare me to be the person to first respond. Thank you so much again. Oh, and this is my part again. So I want to summarize our policy recommendations. I know that we've hit it with each segment of our presentation, but I want to bring it all home. I want to bring it all together so that we can really think about what a community that isn't relying on the police for everything, that our first thought isn't something's wrong, I have to call the police. What does that look like? And also, how can we start to mitigate the harm that is caused by over-policing, by over-reliance on the police? So the first step is shifting things away from the police department. You reduce harm by reducing interactions. This means shifting away traffic enforcement, non-law enforcement emergency response, neighborhood safety, school safety, and municipal services. Those shouldn't be under the police department's umbrella in the first place, so we've got to get them back out. And then eliminate proactive patrols. And then you're already reducing the amount of interactions between the public and the police. You're reducing the opportunities for harm that are occurring. You're proactively preventing police initiated violence. And then recommendation 2 is holding officers accountable to reducing harm. So setting expectations with officers up front, which means eliminating that danger narrative from police training, formalizing the definition of use of force to that which is necessary rather than that which is reasonable, require cessation of all formal and informal profiling practices, and that does take some investigating to figure out what is happening, require officers to record every officer-initiated interaction with the public. That includes demographic information, reason for the interaction, and outcomes. And then hold officers and agencies accountable. So this means terminating contracts with agencies that refuse to update training materials. And it means terminating officers who fail to meet these new standards of conduct. And I just want to re-emphasize that the feedback we get most often tends to reflect fear. Fear that if we take police out of the equation, fear that if we reduce policing in our communities, that we're going to suddenly see a flood of violent activities. And what we actually see in the calls to service data, in the citations data, in the arrest data, is that overwhelmingly police officers are not addressing violence. Police officers are causing and creating violence. And what officers are actually doing when they're not addressing violence is policing people's behaviors, criminalizing poverty, criminalizing children. These are all things that make our communities actively less safe. And if our shared goal is a safer community, then we need to start looking at meaningful investments that actually support that shared goal. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Alexandria, and she's going to talk about next steps.
That concludes our second data town hall. You receive a link to a recording of this webinar, a handout packet, including folks to call besides the police, a link to write City Council to make these demands, and a link to schedule a meeting with Accountability for Dearborn organizers. We'll see you at our next data town hall on February 20th, where we'll be talking about citation data.
All right, thank you all so much. I think that's it for tonight. We'll let you have your remaining time.
Yes, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you to all the speakers. You all have a great night.